Today is Friday, April 25th, 2025, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here again with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, has anything interesting happened in the world lately?
It has, and we are going to talk about it. Hopefully you're not sick of it because it's worth talking about. The Pope has died. Pope Francis, Pope for how long was he? About 15 years? No, 12, about 12.
And I saw something that said that well, I guess they've had popes forever, but he's actually was one of the longer ones, which feels like not that long ago he became, Pope John Paul II was a very long tenured pope.
Indeed. Actually, he lasted so long that it really reset modern thinking about how long popes do last. When if you look historically, this actually is a long one, even though it wasn't that long. Regardless, we may not be Roman Catholics, but we do watch such things for reasons that hopefully will be obvious when we get into the podcast. So let's go. Welcome again to the podcast, and indeed, Pope Francis is dead, and a new pope will soon be elected. You know, it does strike me, Mr. Robinson, the incredible timing of the Apple. I can't remember who produced the movie, but it's actually showing up on Amazon Prime now.
Conclave.
Yeah, the Conclave.
I think it
right.
is Apple. Actually.
Is it really?
I think so.
They couldn't have known unless there were a doubt, hey, let's assassinate the Pope so that our movie becomes really, really relevant. But even an Oscar contender this year, and as I think maybe we'll even get to one of the quotes, I've seen one of the cardinals in the press referring to the movie, trying to tell the rest of the cardinals and the world, let's not do it like that. You know, let's do it like this. I actually just up front have not seen the movie, but I understand what they're kind of talking about in it. I've definitely read about it. So the Pope is dead. Now, this is not going to be a surprise to anyone listening here on this podcast. Mr. Robinson and myself are not Roman Catholics. If you read our magazine at all, if you read our literature, you understand that we are not. And yet at the same time, this is something that we absolutely should pay attention to. And we'll discuss why things like this are very important later on in the podcast. But even if you just look at things from a carnal, secular, political approach, if you just look at them from just a worldly point of view, the fact is the Pope is one of the most powerful men in the world. He truly is. He is a head of state. He has influence that others don't. Just look at what Pope John Paul II accomplished when it comes to Poland as a Polish Pope in terms of the impact on communism in his country, in terms of the political affairs there. He has sort of in the United States, people talk about the bully pulpit that the president has. The president may not be able to pass laws, but he can have an influence that other politicians just can't because his pulpit, if you will, carries a lot more influence. And the Pope is a source of influence in the world that no one else really rivals. Well,
and there's over 1.3 billion people on the planet that identify as Roman Catholic.
Wow.
And, the Pope still draws a crowd. When he travels and goes places, it is an amazing number of people that turn out to see him, listen to him speak, and the various functions that he performs. And so naturally, we're going to pay attention to something like that.
Oh, that again, even if you ignore the religious aspect, someone that has that kind of influence, that is about 16% or so of the world population, not all of whom take what the Pope says seriously. You have those that are just kind of Catholic in name only, and yet at the same time, who can actually claim that? Who can claim to be the spiritual leader of 1.3 billion people? My wife and I had an opportunity that I really appreciated. We were actually at St. Peter's Basilica at a time. We were in Rome there on a trip and didn't realize what was going on. My wife and I do not speak Italian. And we just saw all the people headed towards the Basilica while we were there. So we just kind of followed the crowd to see what was going to happen. If anything, we thought, well, maybe if the Pope does show up, we can get some photographs and be able to use them in the magazine and that we'd have for ourselves. Well, sure enough, he did show up. It wasn't like on the balcony or anything. But he did a drive-by on the Pope mobile. I say he did drive by. I imagine him behind the wheel, kind of doing donuts and stuff. But no, he was in the Pope mobile and drove by, and the crowd I could barely see. I am not the the tallest of people, and the crowd we were pressed. I mean, shoulder to shoulder, stomach to back, virtually. I thankfully had a backpack on that I was kind of carrying in the front for convenience, and it sort of gave me some space. My wife was able to hold her camera up and get some pictures. Well, sure enough, he drove by, and the ecstasy in the voices of some of the people was astonishing. There was a woman that was on presumably her husband's shoulders, but so she could see above the crowd. And as he was driving by, I think it was, and forgive me if my Italian is poor, bellissimo, bellissimo, just like, oh, beautiful. I mean, you could just hear this, like she was moved just by the mere fact of seeing this guy drive by. The crowd was absolutely ecstatic. He drove by, did his kind of wave, and then everybody dispersed, and that was about it. So, yeah, you have an individual like that with that kind of influence, and just then magnify that, over the world. Where he goes, everybody pays attention. It's an important, even just civil office, if you will, let alone understanding that he's not just addressing by his words and by his decisions the actual, say, physical policies of a nation, but the spiritual orientation of literally hundreds of millions of people.
Yes. I was going to add, not, which you kind of cover this, but not merely religious influence, but truly political influence. They're the 800-pound gorilla on the European continent, and if you're even with national sovereignty, you pay attention to what the Roman Catholic Church teaches and believes, and what the Pope is saying, because you have members within your country, many of them that believe in the Pope. Believe in
his authority. Yeah, definitely. So, and concerning that, it's with all of those people, and knowing you have that kind of influence, and it is a religious institution. They want to grow, they want to thrive, like other institutions. They feel they have a purpose in the world. And when you look at Francis, the Pope who has now died, you could tell. I mean, it was pretty explicit. He had desires for the future of the Roman Catholic Church. Those who elected him seemingly had desires for that future, and that is that the expectation, the hope was he would be a liberalizing force. There were those that hoped he would reverse, say, the decision about birth control. That would make the use of birth control acceptable for Roman Catholics, many of whom just use it anyway. That he would possibly allow women into some positions where they never have been before. That he would open the doors broad and wide for homosexual Catholics. That he would do so many of these sort of changes they would hope that he would do. And he was seen as a reform-oriented pope. And yet, when you now that it's done, he's clearly not doing anything anymore. It seems like a lot of people are disappointed. He definitely riled things up. He made his famous statement about when it comes to homosexuals, and he said, "Who am I to judge?" Right? That famous statement when a lot of people said, "Well, that's kind of your job to judge, right? You're supposed to judge."
Well, if anybody's going to make the claim, it would be him.
It's exactly right. At least in terms of people on earth claiming that authority, and yet at the same time, he also concerned some in the same, say, homosexual community, because he used certain slurs concerning homosexuals in different circumstances when it was brought up about how much homosexuality is apparently reported present in the priesthood and at the Vatican.
When he was the Pope, or before when he was a...
That's a good question. I got to check. I want to say at least one of the comments I saw, because my understanding is it was 2 occasions, and one of them was when he was Pope, but honestly, I am not certain, so I need to take a look at that. But it could be someone... these days, whatever you said at any point in time in your whole life, will get brought back up again. But the disappointment more isn't things like that, but that he didn't actually, in terms of Roman Catholic belief, the Pope, when he speaks ex cathedra, is meaning, supposedly from the chair, the supposed chair of Peter, which, by the way, the Tomorrow's World magazine that we are currently working on, the July-August issue, will have an article about popes and prophecy, and we'll talk about the supposed chair of Peter. But in that sense, when he's sitting there, he's making pronouncements that are considered that God inspired, right? That this is inerrant, that it is the doctrine and that it's been guided, but not everything the Pope says in that regard. So the Pope, they were hoping he would kind of sit in the chair, so to speak, and even potentially reverse, which if you're going to reverse a previous decision that was inerrant, that takes some art, right, to be able to do that politically. But they were really hoping that he would do that, and he just didn't make any kind of major reforms. In fact, I know some of the material we were looking at before the podcast, it's interesting, even some behind the scenes reform that isn't even kind of public or doctrinal. I don't know. I know we looked at an article from First Things magazine, which for those who aren't familiar with First Things magazine, it's a very very Catholic in its orientation as a magazine, very conservative Catholic in its orientation. At least that's how I would characterize it. And I don't know if did you have time to look at that as well?
Yeah, I read it. It was actually, well, it wasn't a very long read, but it was quite fascinating.
It was fascinating. The title was, the title of this particular article was Pope Francis and the Vatican Deep State. Mm-hmm. And the idea that, who would even think of the Vatican as having a deep state? For those of us, we have listeners we know all over the world. But in terms of the United States, the phrase deep state has been in play for a long time, but in terms of major public consciousness. Thinking of, President Trump was elected and it's like, oh, he's going to dismantle the deep state, whatever the case is. These idea of say politicians, because mm-hmm. that's what you learn about the Vatican is that, yeah, they definitely have their politicians, people that have been in place for years and years from one administration to another administration, that a new pope is a lot like a new president. And he may be really powerful, but he still has people under him that have entrenched positions and have been there forever and don't want a lot of things to change.
Yeah, it was interesting because the Pope came in with quite a bit of authority and mandate and was authorized to do the things he was doing in attempting to reform some of these financial, or I guess especially one financial institution. He got a whole lot of resistance and didn't make it very far and eventually gave up. So it just goes to show you how difficult it is to reform a long entrenched institution with people that have been there for a long time and know what they're doing. It was a fascinating read.
Yeah, I'm really glad you liked it. I know it was really interesting for me too, because it's very easy to think of it just as a church and imagine it as your local church, your local congregation. But, think about some of those local congregations that some of you listeners might be familiar with in terms of, like, say, your local Baptist church, your local Lutheran church, just something sort of small. And even there can be pettiness. There can be like, well, so-and-so's been in charge of the coffee pot, and now suddenly, well, now Sally's going to be doing the coffee pot? Mm-hmm. Well, how come? What's wrong with my coffee? Why was there a change? Well, now imagine that magnified, even just kind of thinking of innocent, human nature, but without piling on it lots of other, passions and desires in terms of, say, wrongdoing. Well, you explode that into a very large bureaucracy. You're at least going to have that. In the simplest of levels, you're going to have human nature and people that don't get along or that have different...
Well, and in this case, the guy who was resisting him the most, who was in charge of this financial institution, did end up getting convicted of mismanaging the money.
There you go, because that's the difference. You actually have... Dear listener, I hope we don't sound too jaded about the world, because I like to think I'm not a jaded person. Ms. Robinson, do you think I'm a jaded person?
No, actually, surprisingly unjaded. Is that a word?
De-jaded? But you come to understand in the world that anytime there is a large accumulation of power, of money, of influence, graft, deceit, agendas, secreted, they do come into play. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to think those things. The fact is, anytime there is a massive amount of power, that is going to draw individuals. And that particular article on at First Things magazine, the woman who wrote that article was actually someone who had been a part of the commission, actually, to try to help, to advise in terms of reforming things, and talked about, no, there's straight up corruption. The Vatican Bank was there involved, and they're trying to clean up things. And it's like just what you would hear from any other government, where they're
Right.
trying to clean out corruption in the government, and it's hard to do because it's all so entrenched, and you end up making enemies.
Yeah. No, that's kind of what I was trying to say earlier. It just struck me that you could replace some names and some details, and this could have been so many different governments or corporations or whatever. Just when people have a lot to protect, they protect it.
That's right.
So
yeah. Well, the idea that he was going to come in and kind of reform some of these things, he was very reform-minded, very, kind of socialist in his bent, right? He comes from kind of a tradition of that, a social tradition of that. And he did do a lot of things where he, I don't want to say just token things. He definitely added some elements of humility to the picture of the Pope in terms of where the Pope resided. He made some decisions about his burial, different kind of things that wouldn't be the same. At the same time, there's still far more money on display, et cetera. It's not, humble kind of in quotes. But generally, his overall approach to, what was expected to be, say, the New York Times called it the Francis Revolution, that somehow he would truly do a lot of reforms, just generally did not happen.
Yeah, that article said he basically gave up some of those reforms.
Yeah, that was the New York Times article. What happened? Oh, that was the First Things article, and then this New York Times article, what happened to the Francis Revolution, came out just recently. But the one thing he did do, and so we'll see, because as we're recording this, the new Pope is not yet elected. They'll get together and democratically with the College of Cardinals choose another Pope. You should read our Tomorrow's World magazine article on democracy. But he did have an influence in that regard. That is, there's certain rules for who can actually be an elector. You have to be a cardinal. I think you've got to be under 80. It's 80 or under 80. I can't recall which. And he appointed, it's either 80% or nearly 80% of those himself.
From a completely different source, I heard exactly the same thing.
Really?
He's kind of so there. I've seen a couple different schools of thought on this, but a lot of people seem to think that they'll select another pope a lot like Francis was.
Yeah, that is definitely one of the schools of thought, is that he appointed these people hoping that while he wouldn't accomplish his social revolution in the church in his lifetime, he would lay a foundation where those ideas could continue. And definitely, I've read from multiple commentators that are hoping hoping his overtures toward, say, the homosexual community would be fully embraced by the next pope, his kind of quote-unquote modernizing, trying to say the full fruits of the Vatican II conference from the 60s, that they would just continue on in the same vein. That said, there are others that recognize that the Catholic Church is in a trial right now in terms of its soul, if you will, because a lot of those things are irritating many of the more conservatively minded Catholics, that they seem to be like whenever the Francis would make comments like that about, like, well, who am I to judge, right? And these kind of overtures, people recognize, Catholics recognize, well, our own teachings judge, right? Our own teachings say that's a disordered relationship. Our own teachings say this is wrong. One of the reforms they were hoping he would allow for was allowing priests to marry, and opening that up. And boy, the stalwarts would say that's not Catholic, so to speak. One of the people in contention that many, say, traditionalists in the Roman Catholic Church are hoping for, which would be Cardinal Sarah, an African cardinal. He's very much a traditionalist, and he actually co-authored, I think co-author would be the word, but wrote a book that also had the name of the previous pope, the one that retired, Pope Benedict, kind of went in together on, and it was defending celibacy in the priesthood as the tradition of the church. And some were saying that was sort of a political misstep on his part, because it would really potentially bring the ire of Pope Francis in terms of supporting that. But that was one of the things they were hoping he would do. In fact, in some of these areas that are suffering for lack of priests, they feel that's the one thing, that if he would just open it up so that priests could be married, that suddenly they'd be getting more priests. Well, he laid that particular foundation that could move things more liberally, But there are quite a number of voices that are saying that's the opposite of what we need. We need what the Catholic Church needs is someone to unify it. The idea of liberalizing was open to the world, bring more people from the world into the church. But there are a lot of voices there inside Catholicism saying, well, no, if we split in two, what difference does it make? That rather we need someone who's more of a traditionalist that is going to reunify what is becoming a divided church. And one of those would be Cardinal Mueller. Cardinal Mueller, who's he's got a German background there, Cardinal Mueller. And there was a great article in the Times out of the UK titled Cardinal Mueller, Church Risks Split If It Elects a Liberal Pope. And he is and he's an elector. My understanding is he still qualifies as an elector, so he's a part of this group. And he has said, and I guess some comments from the Times, he's highlighted, no Catholic is obliged to obey doctrine that is wrong. Catholicism is not about blindly obeying the Pope without respecting holy scriptures, tradition, and the doctrine of the church. Now, when he says that, I take it to mean he's not trying to say the Pope speaking ex cathedra, because that is part of their doctrine, but all these other things that aren't necessarily ex cathedra, where the Pope does say something that seems to counter, Catholic doctrine. The article says that he added, Pope Francis is viewed by the mass media, and there's a risk the cardinals are saying, well, we should continue in this, right? This is exactly what you were just saying. Instead, the article says, that is Cardinal Mueller said, they, meaning the cardinals, have a responsibility to elect a man who is able to unify the church in the revealed truth. Now, he says revealed truth. We would say Roman Catholic doctrine. Mueller shrugged off the labels of liberal and conservative. Everyone's saying liberal and conservative. He says, no, that the divide is deeper than that. He says the Pope must be Orthodox. Now, he doesn't mean Greek Orthodox, but means down the middle in terms of doctrine. Neither a liberal nor a conservative. He said the question is not between conservatives and liberals, but between orthodoxy and heresy. He says, I'm praying that the Holy Spirit will illuminate the cardinals, because a heretic pope who changes every day, depending on what the mass media is saying, would be catastrophic. So that is that's another side of the argument is no, forget this liberal stuff. We got to get back to hardcore Catholicism.
Well, not being a Roman Catholic member, this is just me idly speculating on the side, but to me it feels like if you were going to make a, let's say, politically calculated choice here, kind of doubling down on the direction Francis was going and trying to elect another pope that's like him or maybe even more progressive and pushing the envelope, it doesn't seem to be a very receptive environment to me right now. You and I have talked many times about what we think we're observing, which is not, and move outside just Catholicism, just to Christianity writ large. People wanting more out of their religion, wanting it to press them a little more, wanting it be, well, I guess we could say conservative, but being a little stricter and, let's be a little more, I don't know how to characterize it, but not soft, happy words telling you you're a nice person. Basically, what I used to say when I saw some of these, I don't want to call one. I can think of the name of one right now, but it's kind of a prosperity gospel.
Oh, sure.
You go in and it's basically just kind of makes you feel good about things and God loves you and wants you to have money and a Cadillac and everything like that.
Right.
Exaggerate just a little. And, we did the podcast on Harrison Butker calling for a return to some traditional, like the traditional Latin Mass and other things like that. And I do think that they would actually risk a significant rift, although it's an organization that's been around for a very, very long time. So you never know. But I just think with where the world has gone in the quote unquote mainstream Christian community, if you will, it's going a little more conservative and a little more orthodox. And I'll tell you, here's the one thing I have, and this is just, since a lot of this is just people speculating on what they think is going to happen.
Right.
There's one individual who is used to be part of the, so let's say, Vatican Roman Catholic community, who's a very outspoken critic. I'm not going to say the name because I don't want it to distract from what he says, which it would. But he believes that that they're actually going to elect a non-white pope to show that the Catholic Church is welcoming. Where you know, and you don't have to be. You don't have to be
European
yeah, exactly,
white fella.
Exactly. And so like the black pope that's being considered is a good example of that.
Cardinal Sarah.
But he claims that there's a more big picture thing going on behind the scenes in the Roman Catholic Church, and that there was a document that was written and has been published that calls for the end of the papacy, for there not to be a pope anymore. And you think,
really?
Well, that sounds like the kind of, you know, down with Catholicism plan. Mm-hmm. But it's because of like grander ideals, and that having a pope was kind of too limiting, and they wanted to kind of push aside gently the office of the pope so that they could expand to an even larger audience, that there's desire for it to become more of a one world religion. Now that would actually sound a little bit crazy to me, except for the fact that that's kind of interesting in terms of in light of biblical prophecy, where we see towards the end very much the idea of a one world religion.
Right.
Requiring people on the earth to conform.
Right. Like if somehow, you know, if somehow that could accomplish that, which is which would be a question, but you can see a desire for, well, it's one of the things that makes the Catholic Church stand out from others, is that you have this one single individual who seems to have such authority, you know, and such power. It seems less democratic, even though really he's actually elected democratically. I've wondered if the same sort of thing, that part of the progressives in the Roman Catholic Church are trying to show, look how accepting we are, look at how broad-minded we are. This is a church for you. And if it wouldn't, you know, electing someone who is not, I mean, even when you look at Pope John Paul, who was a Polish pope, it wasn't Italian, right? You look at the Pope Francis, you know, in terms of coming from, again, they're trying to be mindful of what they call the global South, which is really where quote unquote Christianity is growing.
Yes.
And so to actually have someone from not an obviously European oriented first world kind of nation would potentially signal that, and that would make some, like, just to pick on in particular Cardinal Sarah, he's extremely conservative, but on the other hand would bring that benefit to, look, we're not just a bunch of old white guys here. We have elected a black pope. And there are so many, like, you know, it's difficult to judge based on Twitter, because like all social media, it starts feeding you what it thinks you want, so you're not getting a good, clear perspective. That would be a great podcast to revisit. However, I see so many quote unquote conservative Catholics, those who want to go back to a traditional Latin mass, and they said, you bet our priest shouldn't be marrying. You know, they want to go back, like, go hard, what you call hardcore Catholic, you could call that. Man, they are rooting for Cardinal Sarah. You know, they just he's like a pop star, you know, to those guys.
Really?
In terms, oh yeah, it's just really, it's just one after the other I see. So it is interesting. You know, we're coming out of a time. Now, some of you won't even remember this kind of joke, but people used to, like, if you want to say something's obvious, you'd say, well, is the Pope Catholic? You know, you'd say, and we're coming out of a time in a papacy where people kind of question that, you know,
right?
Is the Pope Catholic? Yeah. I'm not entirely sure. And so the idea of electing someone that is unquestionably Catholic, but could somehow bring something else to the mix as well, is a fascinating possibility.
You know, it's interesting. This individual whose name I'm not going to mention is one of his, like, critique is even not quite the right word, but his observation of Pope Francis was that one of the things and I did notice this, by the way, that he was really one of his chief things he was championing. In fact, you know, here he is, turns out, towards the last few months of his life, and he's rallied himself and had enough energy to criticize Trump's border plan, try to really close down. He was big time open borders. And,
he was.
And let people move. And so this guy's speculation was that that's how you, like, the spread of Catholicism is going to be aided by this, especially in North America, because by far the largest group of Catholics is Latin America.
Right.
And so, you know, that's definitely kind of conspiracy a bit. maybe not even conspiracy. You can look at what's going on and make a judgment that could be the case. But the spread of Catholicism, well, if you allow lots of people to flood over the southern border who have Catholic backgrounds, you can really begin to change demographics
in terms of the United States. Yeah, I think that when it comes to Pope Francis, if we're just speculating, given his social leanings anyway, when you look at the social thinking of those who believe that borders should be obsolete, it is this sort of utopian fantasy. If only we didn't keep people out or force people to stay in, everything would be equalizing and such. And when you look at Francis's approach on so many things, he just falls into that kind of lefty category.
Yes.
I could just see that it's really more of a social issue. We're separating the poor from the wealthy and they're keeping out the poor here and there. And I could see that. But what's interesting amongst say your more traditional conservative Catholics, they're not anti-borders, and they definitely want a strong Catholic Church. But they also recognize, for instance, what's going on in Europe because of that. And there is one of the great quotes I came across in doing this research, and it's so much in line with what we have been saying in this ministry in Tomorrow's World for literally years and years and years. Then going back even when this ministry before it was Tomorrow's World, we've been saying. There's this quote. Let me make sure I actually find the article. It's a New York Times article that I grabbed it out of. It was fairly recent, April 21st. It was titled, "Who Among Us? The Cardinals Now Face Their Test." So, of course, the New York Times has a certain direction they would like all this to go. But they made this comment. It said, some cardinals will want a new pope who can mend fences with groups who are frustrated with Francis, such as traditionalists and conservatives in the United States and progressives in Germany. Now, Mueller is kind of an exception in that regard because in Germany you have a lot more progressive popes that want to liberalize even faster.
Okay.
And then in the United States, you've got some, I think Burke was one, but you've got some far more conservative, which is kind of ironic in terms of a lot of other things. But you have someone that maybe you can find someone to mend fences. And it continues in the article. It is possible after history's first Latin American pope, who focused on the world's margins, that they will want Francis's successor to refocus on Europe. It continues here. The cardinals may feel that the European Union, which was born in a spirit of Catholic humanism, and the church need each other as never before. And this might be here in a moment a good time to transition to what the Bible has to say about these things. But I do think that there is something to that. When I see some of these more conservative cardinals and Catholics speaking, they recognize that while letting some of these other cultures in, etc., it's not necessarily increasing Catholicism in Europe. It's increasing an Islamic presence. And you're starting to get a little sense of the Crusades with us. Like, no, we need to defend the borders, right? We need to actually defend Europe. Europe needs to be just European again. Yep. And you see that tied in with some of these conservative Catholic sense.
Well, if you viewed the direction that the Catholic Church can go here with the selection of the new pope through the lens of, well, we want Catholicism to grow, we want it to expand. There's not really a lot of advantage to continuing really catering more to the LGBTQ plus community, because for as much coverage as they get and as much noise as they make, it's still not a very large community in terms of numbers. And there's way more professing Catholics that are a little more conservative. And again, I've seen things that claim that the what are we up to, Gen Z now? Mm-hmm. They're more conservative, just as a group. Yeah. And so if you're trying to attract the future, then to me a continuing down Francis' path of kind of liberalizing things and being a little more progressive doesn't really make a lot of sense.
It's actually more the formula for advancing, quote unquote, that was formulated in the 60s. And what we've had in the world, and honestly you saw this a lot with Mr. Trump's election, is you have a lot of people have had enough time to taste the fruit of that kind of thinking. and recognizing, well, this is destroying all of civilization.
Yes.
You know, this is,
Yes.
they're starting to recognize the chaos of those things. And some of these younger people, when they actually know someone that went into a hospital as one gender and came out supposedly another one, with mutilated and all the rest, then they start thinking, hey, maybe something's wrong. And exactly that. They see Europe becoming not Europe. They see certain crime rates increasing. They see an increase. They don't see an increase in cathedrals. They see an increase in mosques, perhaps. And so I will say, for those who, too often when it comes to open borders, and I speak, Mr. Robinson and I are both Americans, red-blooded, or red.
Not just Americans, but Texans.
That's right. We're also Texans. It's very easy to think of open borders just from kind of an American perspective. And when we think of what people might be trying to achieve, it's easy to think from an American perspective. But Europe is also struggling with it, but their difficulties aren't quite the same as ours. And so they're related, but not exactly the same. Versus the Catholic Church, more than any other nation, even with its growth in the global South, it is very much a European institution. And so it's going to think about these things differently. Well, let's transition into why all of this is important. Part of what we want to do all the time on the podcast is not just think of the news and what's going on and current events the way everyone else in the world does. We want to think about them from a biblical perspective. And from a biblical perspective, there's a lot to address actually here, but what we'd like to do chiefly is remind all of you listeners of the overall arc of prophecy and what to expect from the end times. Because you might think, well, look, why do we care if Catholicism is not actually the truth? And it's not. The Catholic teachings do not line up with the Bible. That's not a surprise to anyone who's been reading the Tomorrow's World magazine. If they don't, well, then why do we even care? Well, we care for good reason. We care because the Bible describes an ancient, powerful, wealthy, counterfeit Christian church that is seen by all the world as truly Christian. And we see that church in the end times bearing Christ's name into the world, claiming to bear his authority in the end times. And we see that church being led by a single, powerful, false prophet. And when you look in the world today, for just those descriptions, but frankly, a lot of other reasons that we definitely won't get into all in one podcast, the Roman Catholic Church and its Pope best fit that picture. The characteristics of that system best fit that coming system.
The list of large religious organizations that could fit that is a very small list. I would pare it down to one, and you could say, well, I don't know, could it be Islam, for example? But that's really, very, very different situation going on over there.
It really is. They might claim, they'll claim they kind of believe in Christ, so to speak. But even then, not like what Christianity does. It's a very toned down alternate version of Jesus.
Well, the other thing I might add to that is it's also described. In fact, it's kind of its name is Mystery Babylon the Great. And that it's going to be a great mystery religion. So you think, well, what does that really mean? I mean, the history of how we got to Catholicism is absolutely fascinating. And then the modern Catholicism. And it is really an ad hoc collection of beliefs that in some areas has a veneer of Christianity. I wouldn't even really call it Christian if you base it off of a really concise definition of what Christianity is.
Yeah. In fact, if you have not read our booklet on Satan's counterfeit Christianity, it's a must read. I don't know what you're in the middle of. If you're in the middle of some romance novel or some sort of fun fair at the beach, you clearly need to put a bookmark in that and set that aside, and then get the booklet on Satan's counterfeit Christianity, because in the next few weeks with the election of this new pope, it is going to become more relevant than perhaps you would have imagined. Mr. Robson just actually referred to a passage in Revelation 17. Maybe it's a good time to then go to that. So in the end times, what is described is this great harlot. We have a telecast on that, Mr. Rod McNair. Oh, I should have grabbed the title of that one. It might be The Great Harlot of Revelation. I'll try to make sure I include a link to that on our website. But Revelation chapter 17, John is been seeing this vision that's been given to him by Jesus Christ. And starting in verse 1, we read in Revelation 17, then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Now we'll pause right there and just say that when God looks in prophecy and talks about, when you look in prophecies from God, and he talks about adultery and harlotry, he uses that as a symbol of corrupting the real faith with pagan faith and with heathen things, and adulterating the pure faith, calling it still good, calling it of God, calling it Christian, if you will, but mixing it together with these other things that are not of God.
The word Babel from the Old Testament and its corollary in the New Testament in Greek is almost identical. Basically means confusion by mixing.
There you go. There you go. So it continues. So we have this harlot, and it's described in vision. Revelation 17 will continue in verse 3. Says, so John says, he, that is this angel, carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. That's not the harlot, that's the beast. So the beast, we won't take a lot of time today, but that does relate to this topic, because the beast, if you've read any of our literature on that, is the European superpower to come. And so the idea that's another connection in here. You have this woman riding the beast. Now, in that case, why would a woman ride? Well, to control it, to kind of trying to influence its direction. You kind of see that in the legends of Europa, which is the woman riding this great bull. Now, for someone riding a beast, doesn't always go well for the rider, and actually in this case, it eventually doesn't. But just continuing here, in verse 4, it says, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. So a wealthy church, and what church out there can surpass the current Roman Catholic Church in terms of its wealth? And
the trappings of looking religious and being, the adornment and the purple.
The robes and the gold.
Rich.
And absolutely.
Well, what content did you, forgive me for calling it that, what content did you make where you talked about, maybe it was one of your sermons, the grandeur of the...
they had like the mass
and
the
mass and
ceremonies.
Everything. It's so well done.
That was the sermon about the white horse. And you know what? We're actually coming out. Look at Mr. Robinson. Look at it. We're coming on the verse to bring that up.
That is a coincidence.
You're amazing. It is a coincidence. So in verse 5, it says, on her forehead a name was written. It's just what you brought up earlier. Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. You see a lot of things here, but among them is the mystery of it all. And when I read about traditional, some of the statements of some traditional Catholics, that's part of what they miss, like having the Mass in Latin. Part of the argument for liberalizing that was, well, we need the people to understand it. But I've seen people that actually lament that, saying, no, it was more beautiful, and it was more there was kind of a mysticism really to it. And when you look at the services and the it's one, I'll just say, artfully, if I ignore that heathen things bother me, it's beautiful to watch. The gold, the trappings, the swinging of the incense, and there's little things they do. I noticed, like for instance, when the priest would hold up the bread that he claims is the literal body of Christ, they would actually very slightly lift his robes just a little bit. And then they would coordinate that and put it down when he brings it down. And if you look into the research, they say, oh, well, that has to do with the time when the robes weren't as mobile and they were doing this. But all this grandeur and tradition, so much of it just symbolic in the tiniest of ways. And it makes you feel like what you hear about, say, like Masonic lodges, right? All these things that bear mysterious symbols. And here, what is it called? A mystery, Babylon the Great.
And the cathedrals are really large and designed to make you feel small.
Absolutely. That was part of when we toured in the Vatican, actually, no, it's not true. We toured in Rome. And the guide there in Rome was saying that the emperors would do the same thing. They would make their spaces vast to make you feel intimidated and small. And then my wife and I walked into the basilica, St. Peter's Basilica, so-called, and it was exactly the same, just what the Roman emperors would do. But another comment here in verse 5 that's important to note, it says, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, of the abominations of the earth. So not only is this religious system, this church, a harlot, compromising biblical faith with adulterating it with pagan things and heathen things, but is the mother that is spawns other flavors of its religion, Christianity, a false Christianity in this case, that do exactly the same thing, that take the Bible and mix it in. It keeps some of mom's pagan ideas, replaces some of those, brings in different ones. So again, really corresponding to this, this picture of this great false church is going to be one that mixes it up, and it's not just purely Christian, not purely biblical, but is going to taint that with other things.
Do you foresee a future where the daughters that kind of fell away are actually kind of called back to the mother church?
There could be a lot of different kinds of accommodations,
for sure.
right?
I would feel like we're in an environment where the Protestant churches are kind of vulnerable to a resurgent Catholicism with an energizing leader kind of calling people back to kind of the mother religion, if you will. So certainly not saying that's what's going to happen, but people have always been looking for meaning, but like it kind of ebbs and flows, and it really feels like what we experimented with in the last century did not prove to be satisfying. The hippie thing didn't work out the way they all hoped, and peace and love, just it wasn't fulfilling, and we're back to. And also, that we're evolved, and there is nothing else is also not satisfying to the human condition, and so we're looking for meaning. And man, if somebody steps in and fills that vacuum and does it in a dramatic way, you can see a lot of people being influenced by that.
Oh, you could see them really draw and really appreciate that someone is standing up on a world stage with influence and giving them meaning in their life. And Jesus Christ said of this future false religion, he says that they're actually going to persecute you and kill you and think they're doing God a service. Mm-hmm. They're going to think they're actually serving God by their willingness to execute you. In fact, actually, that gets us to verse 6 in Revelation 17. He says, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. But it's not just the religious institution itself, it's the leader of that institution. And that's another reason that makes all of this very, very relevant. And that leader is described in many places, and he's called Antichrist here and there, part of a series of Antichrists. The Apostle John said that even in his day, there were already Antichrists in the world. But in Revelation 13, we have a description of this individual. And it says in Revelation 13 in verse 11, he says, I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. Now, the first beast he saw earlier is more the kind of political, military, economic powerhouse beast of Revelation. So that was more the beast the woman is riding. Now he's seeing the religious side. It said, well, it's kind of a combination, but here he sees this leader. In verse 11, then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. In that case, so looks like a lamb. And, I will admit being moved, and whether it was all for show or sincere is kind of irrelevant, really, in the longer picture. But seeing Pope Francis when he would wash the feet of individuals, or you would see him like there was this one fella, his famous picture, come to him very deformed, had kind of like the elephant man disease, as some would call it, from the movie, where it had just all these growths on his head, and it comes, and Francis takes him, and touches his head and brings him close and kind of embraces him. And yeah, stuff like that is moving. And in moments of compassion like that, lives supposedly dedicated to purity and things like that. It's teachings that, at least on the surface, seem to be grounded in the Bible. A lot of people forget the devil tempted Jesus with the Bible as well. So you have someone who leads this institution who looks like a lamb, but then speaks like a dragon, and so speaks like the devil. But the devil doesn't just say, I can't wait to corrupt all of you, and twirl his little evil mustache.
Yeah. I'm glad you're clarifying that because, as a kid growing up in the church, that's kind of what I thought. It was like,
really?
Fooled you all. I'm actually the devil.
Look at my pitchfork. I'm going to stick you with it. But no, you not only do you have Genesis 3 where you're first introduced to the devil, and he's described as subtle. He's very subtle. But you got Paul's comments to the Corinthians saying that he makes himself come across like an angel of light. His ministers come across as ministers of righteousness. That's what this false organization is going to appear. They're going to appear, and it's easy to go, oh yeah, well, I'll just be looking for the people that are fake righteous. He is subtle. And so when you look at this overall picture, that's what we are expecting to see. And now, does that mean that this current configuration of the Roman Catholic Church is that church? I mean, there's a lot of things that can still happen in the future. Does that mean the very next pope that we're going to see is the guy? Mr. Robinson, actually, you were added to the magazine staff at around the election of Pope Francis, wasn't it? Was that the first magazine that you did the cover for?
Exactly right. I came in December, and then couple months later, Pope John Paul II. No. I keep calling him Ratzinger. What was his Pope name?
Oh, Benedict.
Benedict resigned, and then there was actually some kind of a little bit of excitement that there was going to be a new pope. And what does that mean? Turned out to be not too much, I guess. But he did well. We'll see. It's too early to speculate on the legacy of Francis, but yes, and in fact, when we updated the magazine and freshened up the look a little bit, that was the first cover of the new design, and it had Francis on the cover. I actually still really like that one.
It was a simple cover. It was fantastic. In fact, I'll encourage our readers, go to the tomorrowsworld.org website, go to the magazines, scroll back to 2013, I think it was, and look at that cover and recognize you're looking at a Mr. John Robinson classic, first cover out of the gate. But anyway, my whole point in bringing that up was it's easy to think, oh, maybe this is the last one. In fact, people start talking about the whole Malachi prophecy, right? Which I don't know if we want to get into or not.
Well, I can very concisely, for those who kind of wonder about it, this is not a Church of God thing at all. This is the Catholicism and its own in prophecies,
right.
But which, by the way, I found was interesting, was not officially recognized by the church. So
by the Catholic Church.
But there's this Saint Malachi, and he has what's called the prophecy of the popes, and he put together a list of 112 popes that were going to come down after him, and this was in the 1100s. But it's not very precise, and it's these kind of cryptic Latin phrases that describe elements of him. But Francis should have been the last one by that count, and the final pope was going to be called Peter the Roman, and he was going to be kind of the final pope, and he was going to be presiding when actually Rome was destroyed, which I didn't know that
according to that prophecy.
According to that prophecy. So it is interesting, but we appear to be off track unless there's going to be a future explanation.
Well, I have seen at least on Twitter, the source of so much truth. That was said sarcastically, but I have seen some still trying to defend the quote unquote Saint Malachi prophecies, saying that nowhere in the prophecy, that quote unquote prophecy, is it required that all the popes really come one after the other. So maybe there can be gaps in between. I think they're trying to make room. But actually, I do want to highlight that is that really all this is speculation. One of the fascinating details, at least fascinating to me, when I look at the history of the popes, which I have been doing for this article that we're putting out on popes and prophecies for the July-August issue, is that some of them served very briefly. And I'll just say, I'm not actually saying this is true, but let's just say some of them ended their reign in suspicious circumstances. Mm-hmm. But we have a lifetime, reign that could happen. But like even the one right before John Paul II, really in terms of modern era, one of the most famous popes to have served, he only came. Why is he called John Paul II? Because his predecessor was John Paul I, and he only lived in the office for 33 days, and that was it, and he was gone. So we don't want to get caught up in wild speculation that, this might be the last one, this might be the guy. I will say that, looking at the prophecies in the Bible, if I see a pope starting to call down fire from heaven, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that might be our guy. But in this particular case, don't bank on the fact that this one coming is the last one. Don't get caught up in that kind of speculation. We advise all of you listening. What does it mean to think biblically? Part of it means allowing God to do his job, to do what he is going to do with the world. He is the one who is sovereign. He is working all of this out. It's not for ours to over-speculate, but at the same time, we'd be foolish for not watching. So if you're not watching what's going on here, if you're not in the least bit curious of who the Roman Catholic Church is going to elect as their next leader, then you're not paying attention. And if anything, we're living in days where we need to be paying attention.